He stood on the deck of a warship in Tokyo Bay, watching the sun disappear behind the horizon, and he knew with absolute certainty that his country was about to make the most catastrophic mistake in its 1,000-year history. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who would soon orchestrate the attack that would awaken a sleeping giant, understood something his colleagues refused to see. He had walked American streets, studied in American universities, observed American factories churning out steel and automobiles at a pace that defied comprehension. He had seen the future of warfare, and it was not samurai spirit or divine wind. It was industrial capacity measured in tons of steel, barrels of oil, and the will of a people who would not break. But no one would listen. And so Japan would learn this lesson in blood, fire, and the ashes of 4 aircraft carriers sinking beneath the waves at Midway. The year was 1939, and in the ornate chambers of Tokyo's military headquarters, generals and admirals gathered to discuss the inevitable conflict with the United States. Maps covered the walls, showing the vast Pacific Ocean, the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, and the distant American coastline thousands of miles away. The men in this room wore uniforms decorated with medals and ribbons. They carried swords that symbolized centuries of warrior tradition. They believed with unshakable conviction that the Japanese spirit, forged through Bushido and refined through generations of discipline, was superior to anything the soft, materialistic Americans could muster. They spoke of the American people as spiritually hollow, obsessed with comfort and wealth, incapable of sacrifice, unwilling to endure hardship. They convinced themselves that one decisive blow, one carefully executed strike, would shatter American resolve and force a negotiated peace. The Americans, they reasoned, would calculate the cost of war, decide it was too expensive, and retreat to their comfortable lives of jazz music, Hollywood movies, and automobiles. Only one man in that room understood how profoundly wrong they were. Yamamoto sat quietly, his face betraying nothing, but his mind churned with memories that contradicted everything being said around him. He remembered his years at Harvard University, where he had not merely studied military strategy, but had immersed himself in American society. He had traveled from coast to coast, from the steel mills of Pittsburgh to the oil fields of Texas, from the automobile factories of Detroit to the shipyards of California. What he witnessed during those journeys had shaken him to his core. America was not a nation of soft, pleasure-seeking individualists. It was an industrial behemoth of staggering proportions, a country that could produce more steel in a single year than Japan could in a decade. He had seen highways stretching across entire states, vast networks of railroads carrying endless freight, factories operating with a precision and scale that made Japanese industry look primitive by comparison. But it was not just the machines that had impressed him, it was the people. Americans possessed a practical resilience that Japanese propaganda refused to acknowledge. They were inventive, adaptable, willing to work together when circumstances demanded it. They valued efficiency and results over tradition and ceremony. Yamamoto had watched American workers solve problems with innovative approaches that would have been dismissed in Japan as improper or disrespectful to established methods. He had seen American students debate freely, challenge their professors, question authority without fear of punishment. This was not weakness. This was a different kind of strength, one rooted in flexibility and creative problem-solving rather than rigid adherence to hierarchy. When Yamamoto returned to Japan, he tried to share these observations with his superiors. He prepared detailed reports on American industrial capacity, on the psychological resilience of American society, on the dangers of underestimating an enemy that possessed both vast resources and the organizational ability to mobilize them effectively. His warnings were dismissed. The generals and admirals listened politely, then ignored him. They preferred their comfortable illusions. They clung to their belief in cultural superiority, in the notion that Japanese discipline and fighting spirit would triumph over American materialism. They convinced themselves that Americans, accustomed to easy lives and creature comforts, would crumble when faced with real sacrifice and prolonged conflict. Yamamoto knew better. He had seen the truth with his own eyes, and the truth terrified him. He understood that Japan might win battles in the early months of a war with America. Japanese forces were well-trained, highly motivated, experienced from years of fighting in China. They could achieve tactical victories through superior skill and preparation. But wars were not won by tactical brilliance alone. Wars were won by industrial output, by the ability to replace lost ships and aircraft faster than the enemy could sink or shoot them down, by maintaining supply lines across vast distances, by sustaining military operations for years rather than months. In all these areas, America held an overwhelming advantage that would only grow larger as the war progressed. He tried to explain this to anyone who would listen. He warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but after that, American industrial might would begin to assert itself. He predicted that every ship Japan lost would be irreplaceable, while America would build new ships faster than Japan could sink them. He foresaw that Japan's oil reserves, already limited, would dwindle while America's vast petroleum resources would fuel an unstoppable war machine. His colleagues nodded, smiled, and proceeded with their plans as if he had said nothing at all. The decision for war came not from military strategy but from a combination of political pressure, resource scarcity, and ideological momentum that had built over years. Japan needed oil, rubber, and other resources to sustain its empire in China and maintain its position as a great power. American sanctions threatened to strangle the Japanese economy. Negotiations had failed. The military leadership convinced themselves they had no choice. That war was inevitable, and that striking first would give Japan the best chance of forcing a favorable settlement. They would deliver a devastating blow to the American Pacific Fleet, cripple American naval power, seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, establish a defensive perimeter, and wait for the Americans to accept the new reality rather than fight a costly war to reverse it. Yamamoto was given the task of planning the attack. He did not want this war. He had argued against it repeatedly. But he was a military officer, and when his government decided on war, his duty was to serve. If Japan was going to fight America, then the opening strike had to be devastating enough to buy time, to achieve maximum shock and disruption before American industrial power could be brought to bear. He devised a plan to attack the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, using aircraft carriers to launch a surprise strike that would destroy battleships, aircraft, and facilities before the Americans even knew war had begun. The attack succeeded beyond even Yamamoto's expectations. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor with precision and devastating effect. Battleships exploded and sank. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Thousands of American servicemen died in the space of 2 hours. Across Japan, people celebrated. Military leaders congratulated themselves on a brilliant victory. They believed they had crippled American naval power, that they had proven Japanese superiority, that they had secured the time needed to consolidate their conquests and establish an impregnable defensive position. Yamamoto did not celebrate. While others drank sake and praised the successful operation, he sat alone, contemplating what would come next. He understood something his jubilant colleagues did not. The attack had achieved tactical surprise and inflicted significant damage, but it had failed in its strategic purpose. The American aircraft carriers had not been in port. They survived, and in modern naval warfare, carriers were more important than battleships. More critically, the attack had unified American society in a way that nothing else could have. Before Pearl Harbor, America had been divided, with many citizens opposing entry into the war. After Pearl Harbor, that division evaporated overnight. The sleeping giant was not just awakened but enraged, and a unified, angry America with its vast industrial capacity was the nightmare scenario Yamamoto had always feared. He reportedly remarked that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve, though the exact words may be apocryphal. Whether he spoke them or not, the sentiment reflected his understanding of what had occurred. America would not seek a negotiated peace. America would not calculate costs and decide the war was too expensive. America would mobilize its entire industrial capacity, convert its automobile factories to tank and aircraft production, build ships by the hundreds, train millions of soldiers, and fight until Japan was completely defeated. The attack that Japanese leaders saw as a brilliant victory was, in Yamamoto's clear-eyed assessment, the beginning of Japan's destruction. The months following Pearl Harbor seemed to confirm the optimistic predictions of Japanese military leaders. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia with stunning speed. The Philippines fell. Singapore, the great British fortress that was supposed to be impregnable, surrendered after a brief campaign. Burma was conquered. The Dutch East Indies with its vital oil resources came under Japanese control. By mid-1942, Japan had achieved its territorial objectives and established a vast empire stretching across the Pacific and into Asia. Military leaders congratulated themselves. Their strategy was working. The Americans and British, they believed, would soon recognize that reconquering this territory would be too costly and would agree to a negotiated settlement that left Japan in control of its new empire. Yamamoto knew this euphoria would be short-lived. He had bought Japan 6 months, just as he had predicted, but time was running out. American industrial mobilization was accelerating. New ships were being launched, new aircraft rolling off assembly lines, new soldiers completing training. The window of Japanese tactical superiority was closing rapidly. He understood that Japan needed to extend its defensive perimeter, to force decisive battles that would destroy what remained of American naval power before American industry could tip the balance irreversibly. In June of 1942, Yamamoto planned an operation to capture Midway Island, a strategic outpost that would extend Japan's defensive zone and potentially lure the American carriers into a decisive battle where Japanese forces could destroy them. The plan was complex, involving multiple fleet movements, diversionary attacks, and a concentration of Japanese naval power that should have been overwhelming. Everything depended on surprise and on the Americans reacting, as Japanese planners expected them to react. The Americans did not cooperate. They had broken Japanese naval codes and knew the attack was coming. They positioned their carriers in ambush, waiting for the Japanese fleet to arrive. What followed was a battle that lasted just a few minutes but changed the course of the entire war. American dive bombers caught Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment, with aircraft being refueled and rearmed on deck. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning. A 4th would be sunk later that day. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of highly trained pilots and crew. These losses were irreplaceable. Japan's shipbuilding capacity could not produce new carriers quickly enough. Japan's pilot training program could not replace the experienced aviators who died at Midway. The battle represented more than a military defeat. It shattered the fundamental assumptions underlying Japanese strategy. The myth of Japanese invincibility was broken. The belief that superior fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages was exposed as deadly wishful thinking. The Americans had not shown weakness or lack of resolve. They had fought with skill, courage, and determination, and they had won decisively. As the war progressed, the pattern established at Midway repeated itself across the Pacific. Japanese forces fought with fanatical bravery, often refusing to surrender even when defeat was certain, but bravery could not compensate for the crushing material superiority that American industry provided. At Guadalcanal, Japanese and American forces fought a brutal campaign that lasted months. Japanese soldiers, often starving and short of ammunition, launched desperate attacks against American positions. They died by the thousands, and still they could not dislodge the Americans. Japanese naval forces fought multiple battles trying to reinforce and supply their troops on the island, suffering losses they could not afford, while American losses were quickly replaced. The Americans brought to the Pacific everything Yamamoto had seen during his time in the United States. They brought industrial efficiency, logistical sophistication, and a pragmatic approach to problem-solving that Japanese military culture struggled to counter. Where Japanese forces relied on courage and willingness to die for the emperor, Americans relied on overwhelming firepower, superior supply systems, and tactical flexibility. Where Japanese commanders often repeated failed tactics out of loyalty to established doctrine, American commanders adapted, learned from mistakes, and tried new approaches. Where Japanese industry struggled to produce enough ships, aircraft, and weapons to replace losses, American factories operated around the clock, turning out war materiel in quantities that seemed impossible. The very traits that Japanese propaganda had identified as American weaknesses became the foundation of American strength. Materialism translated into superior equipment and abundant supplies. Individualism translated into initiative and creative problem-solving at every level of military operations. The supposed American reluctance to sacrifice was revealed as a myth when American soldiers, sailors, and Marines demonstrated they could match Japanese forces in courage and determination, while also enjoying better support, better logistics, and better overall strategic direction. Japanese military leaders slowly, painfully, began to recognize their catastrophic error in judgment. They had gone to war believing their own propaganda about American weakness and Japanese superiority. They had convinced themselves that spirit could triumph over industry, that willpower could overcome material reality. Reality taught them otherwise, but the lesson came too late, and at a cost measured in millions of lives and the destruction of their nation. Yamamoto did not live to see the final defeat of Japan. In April of 1943, American codebreakers intercepted messages detailing his inspection tour of Japanese bases in the South Pacific. American fighters ambushed his aircraft over Bougainville, shooting it down and killing the admiral who had tried to warn his country of the disaster it was courting. His death was symbolic in a way. The man who understood America best, who had tried to prevent the war or at least to inject realism into Japanese strategy, died while his country continued down the path he had known would lead to ruin. By 1944, the illusions that had sustained Japanese military thinking had completely collapsed. American forces were advancing across the Pacific, retaking islands, destroying Japanese naval and air power, cutting off supply lines, starving Japanese garrisons, and moving inexorably closer to the Japanese home islands. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. At Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a fighting force. Desperate, running out of options, Japanese commanders turned to suicide tactics, sending kamikaze pilots to crash their aircraft into American ships. Even this did not change the fundamental reality. For every American ship damaged or sunk by kamikaze attack, 10 more were being built and sent across the Pacific. The American firebombing campaign against Japanese cities revealed the complete helplessness of Japan in the face of American power. Cities burned. Hundreds of thousands died. Japanese air defenses could do little to stop the massive bomber formations that appeared night after night, reducing urban areas to ash and rubble. The industrial infrastructure that was supposed to sustain Japan's war effort was systematically destroyed. The civilian population, told they were part of a divine mission to establish Japanese dominance in Asia, found themselves starving, homeless, and watching their country being methodically demolished by an enemy their leaders had assured them was too weak and decadent to fight. In August of 1945, the final proof of American industrial and scientific superiority arrived in the form of atomic weapons. 2 cities vanished in blinding flashes of light, victims of a technology that Japan had not even known existed, let alone possessed the capacity to develop. The emperor, breaking centuries of tradition, spoke directly to the Japanese people to announce surrender. The war was over. Japan had lost completely, utterly, irreversibly. The tragedy of Japanese strategic thinking in World War II was not inevitable. Japan had access to accurate information about American industrial capacity. Yamamoto had provided detailed assessments based on direct observation. Other Japanese who had lived in America, who had studied there or worked there, could have reinforced his warnings. But institutional culture, ideological commitment, and the psychological comfort of believing in their own superiority led Japanese leaders to ignore evidence and embrace wishful thinking. They chose to believe what they wanted to believe rather than what the facts indicated. They assumed that their enemy would behave according to Japanese stereotypes rather than according to American values and capabilities. They went to war against an enemy they did not understand, and their ignorance cost millions of lives and resulted in the complete destruction of everything they had tried to protect and expand. The lesson transcends World War II and speaks to fundamental truths about human nature and institutional decision-making. Stereotypes are comfortable but dangerous. They allow people to dismiss information that contradicts their pre-existing beliefs. Cultural arrogance leads to strategic blindness. When leaders surround themselves with people who reinforce their assumptions rather than challenge them, when dissenting voices are ignored or silenced, when wishful thinking replaces clear-eyed analysis, disaster follows. Yamamoto understood this. He had seen beyond the stereotypes, recognized the reality of American strength, and warned of the consequences of underestimation. His country ignored him and paid the ultimate price. The sleeping giant awakened, and Japan learned that industrial capacity, organized effectively and supported by a unified population, was more powerful than any amount of warrior spirit or cultural superiority. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, the oil fields of Texas, the shipyards of California, the laboratories where scientists developed radar and atomic weapons, the millions of American workers who built the arsenal of democracy, these were the forces that decided the war. Not because Americans were inherently superior as people, but because they possessed resources and organizational capacity that, once fully mobilized, became unstoppable. So what do you think? Was Yamamoto a tragic figure, a man who understood the truth but was powerless to change his country's course? Could Japan have avoided this catastrophic conflict if its leaders had listened to his warnings? And what does this story teach us about the dangers of underestimating your opponents and believing your own propaganda? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this story as compelling and thought-provoking as I did, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. There are more untold stories from history waiting to be explored. Stories that reveal truths about human nature, leadership, and the consequences of decisions made in rooms where maps cover the walls and men convince themselves they understand enemies they have never truly tried to comprehend.